Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Welcome to another Sunday afternoon at Amaravati. So the theme for the afternoon's talk, the title is How Can I Stop This Story-Making Factory? Which is an interesting title. I didn't make it up myself, but different members of the Sangha contribute these themes, different ideas for these talks, and this was one that caught my eye. I think all of us have the experience, to some extent or another, of the mind going on and on, just endlessly chattering away. And at first I wasn't particularly conscious of this. I didn't start to try and do any kind of meditation really until I was 21 years old and had started living in a monastery in Thailand. I kind of entered Buddhism in an odd way. I was already in a monastery before I started to learn how to meditate. So I've never really been a lay Buddhist. Yeah. So I was I went to the monastery in order to have a free place to stay. And then, which I thought was a good deal, you know. It was a good opportunity, have a free roof over the head for the night for 2 or 3 days, and then things took off from there. But having arrived in the monastery and having been given a place to stay for a few days, then I asked the monks, you know, what it was that they did, and then they started to explain about meditation. I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. Yeah, I definitely have the need to try that. That sounds very useful, very helpful. And so it wasn't until I started to try to meditate that I realized just how unstoppable the chattering mind was. It was completely, unapparent to me. You know, just in the midst of an average sort of busy student's life in that era, my mind was just going on all the time, but I never really stopped to look at it. So the fact that it was endlessly thinking and commentating and opinionating about life, the universe, and everything, it wasn't terribly obvious to me because I never tried to stop it. As soon as I started to pay attention, and the monks said, well, you know, the way you meditate is you bring your mind to concentrate on your breath, and you hold your attention there on the breathing. So when I tried to do that, and taking the breath as a still point, as a reference point in the mind, it was suddenly apparent how this thing never stops. It just goes on and on and on, and it wouldn't stay on its appointed object. Wouldn't stay on the breath for more than a few seconds before flying away in some different direction. And at first, think, well, hang on a minute, no, I just I need to pay closer attention. I should make a bit more effort because surely I can be a bit I can do a bit better than this. But no matter how hard I tried, with the greatest intention and will in the world, I couldn't seem to keep my mind on the breath more than a few seconds. 10 seconds, 15 seconds at the most, and then away it would go again. So that was the point when I realized, wow, this thing never stops. This mind, it just goes on and on and on. And so then I realized, well, it's probably been doing this my entire life. But I've just never really noticed, never turned my attention inwards long enough to really see what the mind is doing. But because of being so busy and active with everything else that was going on in my life, just living and going to university and spending time with friends and traveling about, filling the mind with all sorts of interesting things and activities, never really noticed what the mind was doing. But when you bring things to a stop, or you try to, and you pay attention, you realize this is really a story-making factory. This really is a generator of thoughts, just like a volcano or a fountain, just throwing out one thought after another, and just deciding, oh, I think I'll stop thinking. I think it would be a good idea for my mind to be quiet. Just having that thought, just having that idea, didn't seem to have very much effect at all. So it was a kind of salutary lesson, first of all, to recognize how uncontrollable the mind really is. And once we notice how the mind, and by the way, is that a familiar experience? But not that I'm psychic, I just, but it's generally the case that when any one of us stops to turn the attention inward and to watch what the thought processes are doing, then we realize this mind just creates an endless string of thoughts and associations and memories and projections and opinions, and just goes on and on and on. And it never even really seems to finish a sentence. Gets halfway through and then off on a different tangent, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another. So when we see that the mind is so active and so busy, and then we begin to notice how oppressive that can be, that actually that endless thinking, the story-making factory, can be productive of a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, just the capacity of the mind to create worries and internal difficulties and stresses, so that we can't sleep properly at night. We're always getting upset in different situations, say feeling nervous or feeling irritated or feeling excited or carried away by different situations, just because of what the mind is adding on to, say, an encounter with some other people, or a job that we have to do, or a situation that we have to deal with. So it can be that the thinking capacity of the mind becomes like a kind of inner tyrant, endlessly making our life more difficult and complicated and confusing. Even simple things like going into a cafe and ordering some food, or meeting members of your family, or coming to listen to a Dhamma talk in the monastery. Simple everyday things can be fraught with all kinds of projections and anxieties and worries about what the other people think about us, or whether we're going to get something right, or whether someone's going to take my favorite spot. This, even in a meditation hall, you can experience feels of ownership, territoriality, when you come into the meditation hall and someone has taken your seat. Yeah, and it's not even your place. It's just, but somehow you've claimed ownership, and the mind has created a story about how you have to sit there, and that's the right place, the best place for you to be. So when we begin to witness how much of a tyrant and a tormentor the thinking mind can be, then we can wish to switch it off in any way possible. And so sometimes we can take meditation and the capacity to concentrate and use it as a kind of club to beat our thinking mind into submission. Like, shut up, smash, and just using our will and effort to just force the mind to be quiet. And sometimes, particularly if we have good powers of concentration or a lot of will, we can make that happen. But that kind of inner quietude is rather like taking a busy 2-year-old and sort of wrapping duct tape around their mouth and expecting that to bring real peace and quiet. I remember when I was thinking of busy 3-year-olds, every year my family used to go on a summer holiday to visit my grandmother's relatives in Ostend in Belgium. Their family had a hotel on the seafront, and the whole family would go over from England on the ferry, the mail boat from Dover or Folkestone. It's a 3.5-hour ferry ride across the channel to Ostend in Belgium, and we'd make all this journey together. And my grandparents would rent a little cabin on the boat, and I was very chatty as a young child. It's hard to believe, I know. But apparently I was completely quiet for the first 18 months. And my mother even thought there was something very wrong with me, because I just lay there in my pram and just looked. I didn't utter a peep. But at 18 months I started talking, and I didn't stop for any reason. So we were on this boat ride across the channel, and my grandfather, who was this very, very quiet and sort of shy and sort of gentle old Jewish businessman, he said, "I will give you 6pence. I will give you 6pence if you stop talking for 5 minutes." And at that age, I was like 3 or 4 years old, 4 or 5 years old. 6pence was serious money, and I nearly exploded with the effort of trying to keep quiet for 5 minutes. And I don't think I could manage it. I think I didn't earn my 6pence. So just trying to stop the mind from pouring forth its verbiage, all the words, just by force, just by suppression. It's like the sort of 5-year-old Ajahn Amaro trying to be quiet for 5 minutes. You're just applying pressure and force, but it doesn't bring a very peaceful or beneficial result. And trying to just suppress the thinking mind into submission, it just makes us explode, and it brings a very say very painful and even more stressful and complicating result than even just letting the mind carry on thinking. So suppression of the thinking mind is trying to stop it and make it go quiet by force, or just say using drugs or alcohol to make it go quiet. That doesn't really bring any kind of solution. But rather, in the way of the paths of Buddhist practice, rather we take the approach of understanding what is it that's driving the whole process. What's the fuel that the factory is running on in the first place? Why does the mind do this, and how can we learn to stop that whole process from running, so that we're not energizing that agitated proliferation of thoughts in the first place. Well, there's a very helpful sutta, a Discourse of the Buddha, where he talks about this very process, where it's described. And the story starts off with the Buddha sitting under a tree in the forest, and he's meditating by himself in the woods. And this Brahmin called Dandapani, which means stick in hand, and it seems like he was some kind of a professional debater, and he was someone who would engage people in argument as a kind of sport or as a way of life. And even today in India, if you want some entertainment at a family event, like, rather than sort of hiring a band for your wedding, you hire a couple of philosophers and get them to debate in front of you and have a good philosophical, spiritual argument. So Dandapani was one of these kind of debating Brahmins, and he saw the Buddha sitting under a tree, and he thought, okay, I'll try my hand with this one. So he goes up to the Buddha in this very kind of arrogant, strident way and says, "So, you're a wanderer, you're a yogi. What kind of philosophy do you teach? What kind of practice do you follow? What's your spiritual path?" Basically trying to provoke him or get an argument going so he could prove how wise and clever he was. And the Buddha responded by saying, I engage in the practice and I espouse the principle of non-contention. Not to argue with anyone in the world. So then Dandapani, having heard that, is as it says in the sutta, it says, you know, he clicked his tongue, puckered his brow into 3 furrows, and then strode off, having nothing further to say. So he's completely frustrated by that. So then, when the Buddha went back to the monastery and he recounted this story, and he talked about this and said, you know, that it's only when you've removed the causes for mental proliferation, conceptual proliferation. You know, this is how we end the quality of conflict. This is how we develop the mind, the heart of non-contention, is through truly understanding how the mind creates proliferations and gets attached to the perceptions that it has created. You know, how the mind creates stories and then gets lost in the stories that it creates. It's only when we understand this that we can stop the causes of contention, contending with others in the world and also contending with ourselves. So he made a very brief statement on this and then disappeared off and went into his kuti, his hut by himself. Probably having had his meditation interrupted in the forest by Dandapani, it seems like he was also ready for a bit of solitude. So then the other members of the Sangha asked Mahakachana, say, can you explain what the Buddha meant? Because Mahakachana was the one who was most well known for being able to explain in detail statements made by the Buddha in brief. And so then Mahakachana said, well, you know, you should really be asking the Buddha these questions yourself, you know, when you next have the chance, but I'll do my best to explain what I think he meant. And then what Mahakachana explained, he said, well, you know, the way that this thing works is when say for example, when the eye sees a mental object, when there is a light and the eye, and then eye consciousness arises, we call this contact, the coming together of these 3, of light, of the eye, and of eye consciousness. When those 3 come together, we call that sense contact. When there is sense contact, that gives rise to a feeling, pleasant feeling, painful feeling, or neutral feeling. Yeah. When there is a feeling, then that gives rise to a perception. That the perception of saying a red color or a green color or blue color in terms of light or a particular shape, and so that perception, sanya in Pali, that that word, the word sanya, is related to the English word sign. So it's like the shape or the form of what's experienced. And then sanya gives rise very quickly to thought, to vitakka. So then you see something, the eye receives the light, there's a perception, and then the thought says tree, or it says, you know, Brahmin approaching. There's the thought that names the thing that's being perceived. And then, after the thought, after vitakka, then the thought gives rise to what is called papancha. So this is the main subject for this afternoon, is this what this word papancha refers to. The English best English translation for this is conceptual proliferation, the mind's capacity to create associative thought, one thought running on after another, after another. Papancha. And that conceptual proliferation then leads to what is called papancha sanya sankara, which is the multiplicity of thoughts and perceptions and feelings that beset the heart and give rise to the experience of conflict. Basically, a me in here, a world out there, and a sense of stress between the two. So this is how it works. So you have contact, feeling, perception, thought, conceptual proliferation, and then papancha sanya sankara, the whole multiplicity of thoughts and perceptions that arise from that proliferation. So this is how the factory works. It all starts off with a perception, hearing a sound, seeing an object, smelling something, tasting something, or also a thought, randomly arising memory or an idea. This also counts as a sense object. Within the Buddhist psychology, the mind sense is another of the sense organs. So the eye perceives light, the ears perceive sound, the mind perceives thoughts and emotions. So then the Mahākāccāna mapped out the process like this, and said, this is how it is, that as the mind is influenced by perceptions, if the mind is untrained and habitually following greed, hatred, and delusion, then it in a very rapid succession, everything that we see or hear or think, then that gives rise to an association, and off the mind runs. When I was starting my time at Wat Pah Nanachat, that monastery that I showed up to for a free place to stay in Thailand, and I was very inspired and very attracted by the teaching and the way of life in the forest, and living in the very simple, down-to-earth way of a forest monk. And as I said, it was very clear to me how out of control my mind was. But even though that I didn't experience very much peace or inner quietness in the meditation, I had a lot of faith that this was the right direction to head in. And what was really one of the things that was really striking to me was that for the first 2 or 3 years of my monastic life, almost everything that happened was like a cue for a song. Now, some of you will remember those sort of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby movies, the road to Morocco, the road to Rio, and every so often one of them would turn to the other and say, "That sounds like a cue for a song," and then they would burst into the next number. Right? Is this familiar to some? I see people nodding it. That sounds like a cue for a song. Well, my entire life, every day, seemed to be like that's like a cue. That sounds like a cue for a song. I'd hear a word that somebody would say, or that some food would be offered, and at the mealtime, and then there would be just the color of a piece of fruit, or a word somebody used, or the smell of some kind of the rain on the earth in the forest, and then off the mind would go, and and because I spent most of my teens filling my head with pop music, there was a lot of songs in there, and I was staggered by the amount of music I could remember, and not even just pop songs that I listened to on the radio, but even from when I was a small child. My sisters had these Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals. You remember LP records, like South Pacific, Oklahoma, and my memory could come up with whole tunes, whole songs from Oklahoma and South Pacific, and these musicals just. One little word, and then, oh no, there it goes again. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh no. And just you could see the mind's hunger for having some object, something to get hold of, something to chew on, and everything would be a cue for a song, or at least a string of thought. So in seeing how this process works, you might think, well, okay, understanding or having a map for how it works, it still doesn't get the thing to switch off. So we are fed up with listening to Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals, or our own individual versions of it. Then it's important to recognize that the more mindfulness that we bring to what's going on mentally, then the more that we can have an effect. Because as Mahākāccāna mapped out in that discourse, and by the way, after he had given this discourse, then Ananda was listening to it, and then he later on went to the Buddha, and he explained what Mahākāccāna had said, and the Buddha said, "This is very good. What Mahākāccāna said is exactly what I would have said, and there's no difference whatsoever. He has said the words that I would have said precisely." And So Ananda, in his usual effusive way, said, "Well, yeah, it's such a wonderful talk. It was so marvelous. It was so amazing. It was so incredible. It was so sweet. It was so delicious. It was like a ball of honey, like a perfectly formed sweet morsel. What should we call this discourse?" And the Buddha said, "Well, you can call it the honey ball sutta, or the sweet morsel." So that's why it's called Madhu Pindika. It means the honey ball sutta, because it's such a sweet morsel of the teaching. So the Buddha confirmed that Mahakachana got it right, so that the more mindfulness that we're able to bring, then the more we're able to see that process happening. And as the mind starts to go off on this kind of associative chain, so that we hear the sound of a bird, and we say, oh, and maybe we hear a pigeon sitting on the roof, crowing in the morning, and think, that sounds like a pigeon. When I was a child, I used to think those were penguins. Why did I think they were penguins? I lived in Kent. But I was convinced there was penguins, because it sounded like what a penguin would sound like. Well, penguin. Yeah, I've always wondered, why do they call those chocolate bars penguins? That's very strange. Now, I wonder who... They actually employ people to think up names of chocolate bars. Actually, I also wondered about, colour cards. When you're buying paint, all the paints in the colour card, they have all these strange esoteric names. Now, someone must have a job. I wonder if you can go to college and learn how to make up... Then you realize, hang on a minute. I'm now discussing the nature of choosing names for paints. And it started off with the sound of a bird. So then, the more mindfulness you bring to it, the more you're able to recognize, well, hang on a minute. I'm sitting here in the sala at Amaravati, or I'm sitting here in my home, and I heard the sound of a bird. There was a sound, and then the whole thing took off from there. So one of the ways that we can use mindfulness and helpfully understand this process is that as soon as you realize that you're completely lost in your thoughts, it's easier to do this in meditation, but also just in the ordinary flow of your days, you can do this. When you realize that your mind has got carried off on some extensive sidetrack, and you realize, now wait a minute, why am I sitting here trying to work out what kind of a college course you would do to learn how to name paints? Now where did that come from? So I was thinking about the paints came from the thought about the chocolate bars, and the chocolate bars came from the thought about the penguins, and the penguin came from that strange perception I had when I was a child, and that came from the sound of the pigeon. So it all started off with just hearing that sound. There was the sense contact, there was the phassa, the contact, then there was the feeling, it's a pleasant sound, then there was the perception of, oh, that's the sound of a bird, so contact, feeling, perception, and then I thought, pigeon, and then from the thought, from the vitakka, then the papancha, the papancha mills started turning, and then off it went. So that you trace, if you take the trouble to trace it back, to follow the whole string of thoughts back to where it came from, you recognize that even when you start off, and it can often be a lot more emotionally loaded than thinking about paint color. Or maybe that can be a very emotive subject. So I know choosing paint colors can be something that has a lot of charge to it. But it can be something more stressful, like how somebody has really done you wrong, and how that awful person really should be set straight, and that he shouldn't be like this, and she shouldn't have done that. She's always doing that. She knows it annoys me, and creating a lot of emotional charge and stress within us. But we can trace it back from that stressful state where it's sort of me in a state of tension or conflict with the world. As we trace it back, then it gets more and more simple. Whereas we start off at a place of complexity and stress, then the further you trace back the whole process, the simpler it gets, until you realize, oh, it was just a sound. It was just a sound, and then this whole thing launched from that. So this practice of following things back to the source. It takes an effort, as a quality of mindfulness is needed for that, but it can be extraordinarily helpful. And in later years, after this was a kind of practice Luang Por Sumedho would often talk about and encourage people to do. And I found out later on that there was a great master of the Korean tradition of about 300 or 400 years ago, the Chinul, who also developed the same kind of practice in Zen meditation in Korea. And he used the term tracing back the radiance, as a book of his teachings that's got that title. And he describes in some detail this kind of methodology of how to patiently and steadily always follow the thought back to where it came from. And then when we do this, as soon as you notice that your mind has got lost in some kind of proliferative excursion, as soon as you know the mind's got lost, first of all, to make a careful note, okay, what does this feel like? Here I am, I'm creating this story in my mind about this particular monk who really is an irritating person, or this particular nun who I've really upset and I've got to straighten things out with, or this particular member of my family who's in a difficult state, and it's up to me to try and make them all right. As soon as you are aware that the mind has got lost in some proliferation, take a note of what that feels like. That sense of responsibility, the sense of anxiety, the sense of desire or fear or indignation. To let yourself feel that and to recognize, okay, what's this like? What's this emotion in the body? Where do I feel this indignation or this anxiety or this pressure of responsibility or this compassionate concern? What's it like? Where do I feel it? Where is it in the body? What's its texture? And to let yourself be fully aware of that stressful, pained quality. And then as you mindfully trace back the thought, the energy of the thought having been followed back to its source, then when you get back to the recognition, oh, it was just a random memory. It was just the smell of that particular dish at the mealtime. It was just the sound of that bird, or it was just the phrase that somebody used. It's just, I heard that sound, I smelt that aroma, I saw that object, and then that's where it came from. When you bring the attention back to the initial sense contact, again, notice how that feels. What's the tone, the texture of that experience? Just hearing the sound, or smelling the aroma, seeing the object, and inevitably, whereas where it starts out from, where you've ended up, there's a stressful, tense, burdened, and insecure or tight quality to it, agitated quality. When you bring it back, when you follow it back to its source, to its origin, to the sense perception, it's always extremely simple, uncomplicated, and straightforward. Even a loud sound, or a bitter taste, or a harsh color, it's just a color, it's just a sound, it's just a thought. And if you let yourself really experience and fully know that quality of simplicity, then recognize, okay, this is easy to be with, this is not burdensome, this is not difficult, there's no insecurity or trouble associated with this. So this is one methodology of learning how to work with the conceptual proliferation and the stories the mind tells. Another kind of practice that's similar to this, or related, that many of you who will have listened to Ajahn Sumedho's Dhamma talks over the years will be familiar with, is making the thought conscious. And so this is, again, it takes a degree of mindfulness and an application. But when you are, say you're feeling some kind of regret, something that you've done, you feel very bad about, oh, I'm such a terrible person, I fell into that bad habit again, I said I wasn't going to do that, and I did it again, I'm such an awful person, there's no hope for me, they should just sort of take me out at the back of the barn and just finish me off, I'm a burden to society, I'm just taking up space here, life would be much better off without me. Or if you're upset with somebody else, like, how could she do that? That's so terrible. She knows that I don't like that. She was at that meeting when we all agreed that we weren't going to do that, and now she's gone and done it, and I know she does it on purpose. She's deliberately doing that just to make me upset, and that I'm not going to let her go. Not going to let her get away with it. She's not going to get away with it. And so we hear these kind of. We all have our own particular scripts that I'm not reading anybody's mind, in case you're worried. Like, oh my God, how did he know? There's no mind reading involved. It's just human nature is pretty much the same everywhere. So when to hear what the mind is saying, it's like. And what Luang Por Sumedho would encourage is that when you hear your mind ranting on about what you're worried about, what you're excited about, what you've got to have, I got to have it, I got to have it, I got to have it. I can't stand it. She's doing it again, or I'm such an awful person. Whatever it might be, some kind of a pattern of thinking. As soon as you notice, the mind has got lost in one of its stories, it's got carried away with this particular judgment. Oh, this person is awful, or this is a wonderful thing, and I've got to have it, or I'm an awful person or a wonderful person. If you then catch the thought, it's almost like as if our thoughts were playing on a recording, like on I would say tape. That dates me even more, as much as Rodgers and Hammerstein. But rewind, go to a different place on the MP3 file, go back a bit on the file, and you catch the thought and replay it, so that you are able to listen to what your mind is saying, very deliberately. And this is a very powerful practice because, and I've used this a lot over the years. So if you take that thought and then you replay it. But replay it in full consciousness, like saying, I'm just taking up space. The world would be much better off without me. Or say, she's doing it again. I know she only does that to annoy me. And when you do that, and you replay a thought of that nature, you can't usually get to the end of the sentence before the whole thing collapses. Because those kind of thoughts of praising, of judging, of liking, of disliking, of self-creation, creating perceptions about yourself or perceptions about others, they depend upon not really being seen clearly. They're sort of off in the wings and at the edges. And when you get them into the full light, front center stage with all the lights on, then they can't really stand up. You can see all the strings. You can see how it's all held together. So when you do this, and it's quite a simple practice, but it's incredibly effective. Just to state that, like, if you were different, I would be happy. Right? You can't even finish the sentence. It's not even a long sentence, but it's because before you even finish it, oh yeah, really? Yeah. And you wouldn't find anything else to be upset about? Oh, congratulations, that you would be completely happy if someone's behavior was a bit different. Oh. And you realize, no, that's not it. And you begin to see how much the mind has just bought into its own projections, its own anxieties, insecurities, loves and hates and habitual judgments. And how it's so much of it is just driven by our own inner habits of like and dislike, our own insecurities that might maybe move towards greed and desire if you're a lobha-chirita, a desire type, a greed type, if they move towards a doubt and worry and fear, or confusion if you're a moha-chirit type, a confusion type, or towards irritation and complaining and contending if you're a dosa-chirit. You don't have to memorize these. 3 basic character types: lobha-chirita, greed type; moha-chirit, delusion type, a dosa-charit aversion type. It's a kind of simple map of human psychology, but where we get lost in these particular habit patterns. So if you have those tendencies, like your mind moves towards greed or moves towards aversion, then, and that's a strong habit, then it just will pick up any kind of an object, so that the process of proliferation then feeds on that tendency. So say if you're an aversion type, that you've created a lot of habits of negativity. You're creating the sense of self around complaining, criticizing, judging others. That's where your sense of being comes from. Just the mind creates a continual list of what's wrong with others, or what's wrong with the world. They're having a good grumble. That's what makes us feel alive. Or contending with something, having a good argument. Having or complaining and criticizing. Opening the newspaper. And having a good grumble. It gives us a sense of being. And or if we're a greed type, that what we want to get, what we want to have, and the things that we want to chase after. So then those habits are, say, then they're like the fuel that the story-making factory runs on. And so that when we begin to see that process, and we're able to, say, catch a thought like, I can't believe she did that again. If only she wouldn't do that, I would be happy. And you realize, when you hear that, and you just freeze that, and you replay it, you realize, no. It's just my mind, that's my aversive tendency looking for an object. As one friend of ours put it in a very kind of neat way, he said, the syntax of aversion requires a direct object. For those of you familiar with English grammar, that the syntax of aversion requires a direct object. When your mind is disposed towards aversion, anything will do. You're just looking for a thing to be annoyed about or to complain about. Or if it's greed, that your mind will find some way of wanting what it's hearing, what it's seeing, what it's smelling, what it's tasting. The syntax of greed also requires a direct object, like, I want that. But it doesn't really matter what the object is. And in this way, we realize that the mind is kind of shameless. Anything will do to have an opinion about, to have a desire for, to have a complaint about. Anything will do. Any old rubbish will do. And so to recognize how that process works, and to recognize the suffering and the insecurity, the alienation that comes within us, when we follow that, then the more we recognize that pain, the painfulness of that, then the more we're inclined towards letting go of the source, the cause, the greed, hatred, and delusion that's the fuel for the whole process. So this practice I highly recommend. Again, it takes a bit of mindfulness, but it's really worth doing, and it's kind of shocking how quickly your well-formed opinions, loves and hates, all fall apart when you really sort of bring them center stage and put the lights on and look at them closely. They all seem hollow and pointless, and that they fall apart. But then when they fall apart, and you realize, well, actually, I know I wouldn't really be happy if he did something differently. I know I wouldn't really be happy if I got that thing. It's just like a conjuring trick, and then to recognize that voice of wisdom in your heart that says, yeah, right. I'm sure I'd find something else to be upset about. That to listen to that and to be informed by that, and then that ameliorates the habit of following that compulsion, that opinion, and that attachment. So then, this is a lot to do with learning how to listen to the mind. So learning to listen to our thoughts, and in this respect, when we're trying to deal with the story-making factory, and learning to relate to our thoughts and our opinions, one of the biggest obstacles is that we have this weird belief that because we think something, we assume it to be true. This is a theme I talk about a lot. But this is a very weird presumption to make. Right? Just because a thought forms in the mind, we take it to be an accurate representation of reality. This is a very peculiar thing to believe, because what we're thinking today might be very different from what we were thinking a year ago. And if we were right then, how can we be right now? Or if we're right now, how could we have been right then? And if our thoughts, our opinion now, if we're so sure this is right, then in a year's time when we think something different, yeah, what does that say about what we're thinking in the present? Right? I mean, the logic is not very complicated. But yet, we still assume if I think it, it's true. And if other people think differently, they're wrong. Very simple. And they'll either see reason and allow themselves to be set straight, and they'll think like me, or they'll just continue to be deluded and think differently. That's how we function, isn't it? It's crazy, but that's how we operate. So one of the first steps in this is to learn to not believe your thoughts. Or as Ajahn Amaro once famously said, right here in this sala, and during a winter retreat one year, he said, he was giving a Dhamma talk and talking about the nature of thought, and he paused for a moment and said, all your thoughts are garbage. All your thoughts are garbage. And you could feel a few people say, well, hang on a minute. You know, some of my thoughts are very intelligent. You know, maybe all your thoughts are garbage. But it was a very insightful and helpful comment, because when you say, okay, well, they all go in the rubbish pile, then it gives you a different way of holding them. It gives you a different context, that they are. If you more look at your thoughts as just something that has a vague relationship to reality, but it's nothing that's fixed or absolute or permanent, that it's a sort of a working hypothesis or a convenient fiction, then it can be useful. But when we take all our thoughts to be absolutely true, then this is one of the reasons why we end up being in conflict with others. Because if I'm always right, I'm not going to meet with everybody who. It's not going to be the case that everybody that I meet is going to think in the same way. Therefore, if I'm always right, then I'm going to keep meeting with people who are wrong. And then the more I hold on to my rightness, then the more I'm in a state of conflict and separation from others. So the more that we can recognize, well, my thoughts are all garbage, and that they are just convenient fictions that are useful for certain purposes, and they can have a certain value, but they're nothing absolute or reliable or permanent. They're just a kind of thumbnail sketch of reality rather than an absolute reliable representation. Then, when somebody thinks differently, then you think, oh, that's different. That's another way of looking at it. That's interesting. I never thought of it that way. Rather than you're wrong, or like idiot. Just because they express something differently. And so that capacity to to listen to your thoughts and to listen to the mind and not to believe in it is very, very helpful. To just listen to your thoughts as if you are listening to the neighbor's radio. I often use this as an example. So you didn't even choose the radio station. Again, I know talking about radios makes me dated as well, but they're still around. But the listening to something that's there's some news report or some advertisement or some documentary or some story going on. You didn't even choose the station. You didn't even you didn't create the story. But it's just this verbiage running through the airwaves. You can hear it. You understand the words. It's not particularly interesting. It's not even particularly relevant. Just like the tunes and stories that play in the mind. And so then you don't need it to switch off, because you don't need it to go away, because you don't have to give it much credibility. You don't have to imbue it with meaning and value, so that in terms of listening to the creations of the story-making factory, you don't even have to make it stop. You can just stop your interest in it. You can stop your investment in that and let it go. So That brings me to the in a way probably the final theme to reflect on is that we can be so stressed and oppressed by our thinking habits that we believe that we would really be happy if we could just switch the whole thing off and just never think again. Ever had that thought? Please just shut up. Just shut up. And so we can look upon thinking as a kind of brain disease, like this sort of unstoppable noise going on between our ears, and that if it would just be quiet, then we'd be happy. But as Luang Por Chah would say that if it was an absence of thought that made us enlightened, so then this table would be an arahant. The bricks of this wall would be enlightened because they don't think. There's not a thought going through that brick or this table. It's not, but it's not enlightened. So we shouldn't think of the absence of thought as being an enlightened state. It just means you're not thinking. This means that there's quietness, but that quietness is not intrinsically liberated. It's not an awakened or liberated state. And that thought, once the mind has learned to concentrate and learned to be able to focus on the present and learn to not believe in the creations and stories that the mind tells, then you can actually use thought. You can use words to help the mind to understand things in a better way. We can learn how to think clearly. So this is an area that is maybe not given so much, coverage, not talked about so much in the Buddhist meditation circles. But if you read the teachings, the suttas, the Buddha makes a lot of what's called wise reflection, yoniso manasikara, and that there's these kind of phrases repeated over and over again. Wisely reflecting, a person will consider that how that which is born is going to die, or that they will consider, if my mind dwells upon thoughts of aversion, then that's the direction it will be inclined to go in. If the wisely reflecting, you consider if the mind dwells upon thoughts of loving kindness, then that will be the inclination that it has. So wisely reflecting is a very common phrase, and that's not an accident. So the capacity to reflect, to use conceptual thought to explore what the nature of an experience is, to in a way map the territory of our experience, our perceptions, our thoughts, our memories, our ideas. There's an ability that we have to say recognize patterns, how things work, and reflective thought can be extraordinarily helpful in say developing that. So a few well-placed thoughts can save you weeks, if not years, of grief and suffering. That it's really quite remarkable how when we pick up a situation or a pattern of experience and consider it and use the ability to investigate. So yoniso manasikara is one phrase you have in Pali. Dhamma vijaya is another almost identical phrase. This way of investigating the reality, the patterns of an experience. That is a very powerful tool. In fact, Dhamma vijaya is one of the factors of enlightenment. So the enlightened mind naturally employs this capacity to recognize patterns, to understand, to see how things fit together and how one thing leads to another and how things interrelate with each other. And so that's a very useful faculty that we have. It's an important capacity that we can draw upon. And using conceptual thought to guide that and to help formulate that is very very helpful. So that just to be able to reflect, well, why am I so upset? I see somebody carrying out an action that they are. I see somebody parking their car in a certain spot, and my mind says, and my mind's got upset about it. Look at that. I mean, why is my mind upset? Well, because my mind has the perception that that's my lawn. And then from that perception, they shouldn't park on my lawn. How dare they? Don't they know I'm the abbot of this monastery? They shouldn't be parking there. Ah, well, that's why my mind is upset, because I call that my lawn. If that wasn't my lawn, then I wouldn't get upset. Aha. So there's a reflection. You're using conceptual thought to look at, say, oh, look at that. If I was a visitor to this monastery and I saw somebody's parked their car, on the grass in front of my kuti, then I wouldn't get upset. If I was just a visitor, I'd just say, oh, someone's parked their car on the grass. So, people do that. So what? Then because it's my grass, then there's a reaction. So that to use a few well-placed thoughts, then you can save yourself a lot of grief. And using the Buddha's teachings, taking elements of the teaching, and just having those well learned and well remembered, then you can apply those and just bring those into consciousness, and say times like that, well, look, if I call that mine, it's a problem. If I don't see it as mine, it's not a problem. Look at that. So that using the Buddha's instruction about any kind of attachment to I and me and mine, I think it was the I think last week's talk, if I remember, about that was doubt. It was the first week's talk about I and me and mine, and so look at that. As soon as there's I and me and mine, there's suffering. With no I and me and mine, there's no suffering. Look at that. So then, that is the application of thought and the capacity to describe things. And it's also, speaking of stories, why some stories have lasted hundreds or thousands of years, why we keep telling the same stories, or why stories carry a certain power, like the ancient myths, or the stories of the Buddha's life that we tell, or the ancient tales of the Hindu scriptures, or the Bible, or the fairy tales of Europe and around the world, the stories of Shakespeare's plays and so on. We keep telling these stories because they give us a helpful map to our own experience, and so that's why fairy stories or myths or these ancient tales, that we keep telling the same stories. We're using the stories to actually characterize what's going on inside us. They help us to make sense of what we're experiencing, and so that when a child dies and the grief of the mother, the death of a child, then we can empathize with that. We have a story to tell. It's like when the Buddha gave the advice to Kisa Gotami, telling Kisa Gotami, who brought her dead child to the Buddha, saying, "Please, can you heal my sick child? He seems to have died, but I'm sure you can bring him back to life." And the Buddha says, "Well, if you can get me, very easy. All you have to do is get me a mustard seed. It's one mustard seed. That's all. But if you can get it from a house where nobody has died, that's the important thing. But just a mustard seed will do. But it has to come from somewhere, from a house where no one has ever died." And so Kisa Gotami, she goes racing off to try and get the mustard seed. This is going to be so easy. It's not difficult at all. Mustard seed is everywhere. Every house has this. And she goes to one house after another and says, "Can I have some mustard seed?" And they say, "Oh yes, sure." She explains why, and then she says, "Oh, by the way, has anyone ever died in this house?" And they go, "Oh, well, of course, yeah. Last week my uncle died, or oh yes, a month ago my grandmother died." And then house after house after house she goes, and after some time she realizes there is no house in the whole city of Savatthi that has not had somebody die in it. Death is everywhere, and so that she's able to acknowledge and receive the fact that her son has died and he's not coming back. So this is a story. It's a story, but it's a really useful story, because everyone who's had a child or a loved one who's died, or some grief in our life, something that's lost, something that is broken, that can't be repaired, then we have a story like that, and it's a useful story. So by telling that story and reflecting on that, we can say draw upon that in us which says, oh yeah, that's right. I do feel a grief that this thing that was precious to me has died. This loved one, or this cherished possession, or this faculty that I had. I used to be able to hear clearly, and now I sit here for the whole Dhamma talk, and even with the good Amaravati sound system, it's just mumbles. I used to be able to hear, and I now get 10%. Again, I'm not reading anybody's mind. Sometimes it's like that. The sense of grief and loss, it's broken. My hearing is gone, or my vision is gone, or my thinking faculties have gone, and it's not going to come back. There's a grief there, but then the story of Kisa Gotami is like that story helps us to recognize, yeah, that's how it is. That's always been the way the world is, and it's never been different. And the fact that I assumed that somehow I could go through life and never have the experience of loss, nothing that I love to be broken or separated from me. I was foolish. I was in a deluded state to think that it could be that way. So the story helps us to let go. So I would, even though the title of the talk today implies that if we could just stop all stories altogether, I would suggest that stories can be useful. But it's only when they won't shut up, when you can't switch them off, and also when you only get like the first 5%, and then it goes off onto another story, and then another, and then another, and then another. You never actually get to hear the whole story. But when stories, when thoughts are used in context, and they're applied with mindfulness and wisdom, then they can be something that are as much of a blessing as ending the flood of conceptual proliferation. So I'll leave those thoughts with you for today.